Victoria Brennan stared at her phone screen, a triumphant smile spreading across her perfectly made-up face as she confirmed the final transfer. $100 million had just disappeared from the joint account she shared with her husband of 12 years, Tyler. The wife who once promised to love and honor him had spent 18 months meticulously emptying every cent into an offshore account, preparing to divorce the man she now called mediocre and marry Blake Morrison, the charismatic entrepreneur who made her feel alive again. Tyler, the quiet banker who worked endless hours and rarely made it home for dinner, had no idea his marriage was already over. No idea that his wife had secretly moved their entire fortune to what she believed was an untraceable account at Sterling Crown Bank, a prestigious institution known for its ironclad privacy policies. But what Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known because Tyler had kept this part of his life deliberately separate from their marriage, would transform her calculated betrayal into a nightmare she never saw coming. How could the wife who prided herself on being 10 steps ahead have missed the one detail that would unravel everything? What happened when the banker husband she dismissed as forgettable turned out to own the very bank she used to hide the money she stole? And what did Victoria do in her desperation that didn't just destroy her plans, but crushed both her and her lover forever? Tyler Brennan had always been the invisible man in his own marriage. For 12 years, he left their penthouse before dawn and returned long after Victoria had gone to bed, building something she never asked about and he never volunteered. The distance between them had grown so gradually that neither seemed to notice when they stopped being partners and became polite strangers sharing an address. Victoria, a former corporate lawyer who left her career after their wedding, filled her days with charity galas, spa appointments, and eventually Blake Morrison, a silver-tongued investment advisor who told her she deserved more than a distracted husband who treated her like furniture. Their affair began at a fundraiser 16 months ago. Blake had approached Victoria with champagne and compliments, making her feel seen in a way Tyler hadn't in years. Within weeks, they were meeting at expensive hotels, planning a future that required one crucial element: money. Blake's investment firm was drowning in debt from bad deals and angry clients, and Victoria's comfortable life was financed entirely by Tyler's income. She'd signed a prenuptial agreement in a moment of young love that now felt like a prison sentence. If she divorced Tyler without cause, she'd walk away with nothing but her jewelry and car. So Victoria became a student of deception. She studied their finances, memorized passwords, learned the rhythms of Tyler's inattention. The joint account held accumulated bonuses, investment returns, and inherited wealth from Tyler's late parents. $100 million that Tyler never touched because he was too busy building something bigger. Victoria began moving money in small increments, $500,000 here, $1 million there, always to Sterling Crown Bank, where she'd opened an account under her maiden name. The bank's reputation for discretion was legendary. Even government agencies struggled to pierce their privacy walls. She filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional abandonment. Tyler received the papers at his office, his face unreadable as he scanned the documents. He signed them without argument that same afternoon, his attorney noting that Mr. Brennan seemed almost relieved. Victoria interpreted his cooperation as confirmation that he'd never really loved her anyway. She had no idea that Tyler had known about Blake for 14 months, that he'd watched her affair unfold through bank records and private investigators, that he'd been waiting for her to make this exact move. 3 days after filing, Victoria and Blake flew to the Maldives, celebrating their new beginning in an overwater bungalow that cost $15,000 per night. Blake proposed with a diamond ring purchased with Victoria's stolen money, and she said yes with tears of joy, posting carefully filtered photos to social media with captions about finding real love and new chapters. They planned a wedding in Monaco, a honeymoon in Bora Bora, and a life of luxury funded by what Victoria called her fair share of the Brennan fortune. The call came on their fourth morning in paradise. Sterling Crown Bank's fraud department, represented by a woman with a crisp British accent, informed Victoria that her account had been frozen pending investigation into suspicious deposit patterns. Victoria's stomach dropped. She demanded explanations, threatened lawsuits, insisted she'd moved her own money from her own account. The woman on the phone remained professionally unmoved, explaining that the account holder, Tyler Brennan, had reported unauthorized transfers and filed theft charges. Victoria's champagne flute slipped from her hand, shattering on the villa's teak deck. "That's impossible," she whispered. "The account was at Sterling Crown Bank. He doesn't have access there." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds too long. Then, "Mrs. Brennan, are you unaware that your husband is Tyler Brennan? The Tyler Brennan who founded Sterling Crown Bank 8 years ago and serves as its majority owner and chairman?" The world tilted. Victoria grabbed the railing, her knees threatening to buckle. Blake, lounging nearby with his own champagne, sat up suddenly, reading the panic in her face. She ended the call with shaking hands and pulled up Sterling Crown Bank's website on her phone, navigating to the leadership page she'd never bothered to check before. There he was, Tyler James Brennan, founder and chairman. The photo showed her husband in a perfectly tailored suit, his quiet confidence radiating through the screen in a way she'd never noticed in person. All those late nights hadn't been about being a low-level banker at some corporate institution. Tyler had built an empire, one of the most successful private banks in the world, and she'd been too busy looking elsewhere to see what was right in front of her. The offshore account where she'd hidden $100 million was a vault Tyler literally owned. Every transfer, every deposit, every transaction had been visible to him from the beginning. He'd watched her steal from him using his own bank. Blake's face went pale as Victoria explained. His investment firm's debts totaled $40 million, with creditors circling and threatening criminal charges. They'd planned to pay everything off with Victoria's money, Tyler's money, and start fresh. Now they had nothing. Worse than nothing. Victoria faced criminal charges for theft and fraud. Blake's creditors would seize every asset he had left. The Monaco wedding, the new life, the freedom they'd celebrated, it all evaporated like morning mist. Victoria spent 6 hours on the phone with attorneys who delivered increasingly dire news. Tyler hadn't just frozen the account. He'd provided evidence to federal prosecutors showing premeditated theft. The prenuptial agreement she'd tried to circumvent actually protected Tyler's assets even more thoroughly than she'd realized, and her scheme to hide money in his bank created an ironclad case against her. Every lawyer she consulted said the same thing. She was facing 20 years in prison unless she could negotiate something Tyler might accept. Blake deteriorated before her eyes. The charismatic entrepreneur who'd promised her the world became a panicked child, pacing their villa and making increasingly desperate phone calls to associates who stopped answering. His investment firm collapsed within 48 hours. The news breaking across financial channels that Blake Morrison had been operating a quasi-Ponzi scheme, paying old investors with new investor money while living lavishly on borrowed time. The creditors he'd hoped to pay with Victoria's stolen fortune instead filed bankruptcy petitions and criminal complaints. Blake's passport was flagged before they could leave the Maldives. Victoria made one final call to Tyler, her pride shattered but her survival instinct intact. He answered on the first ring, his voice as calm as ever, and she heard something in his tone she'd never noticed before. Not weakness, but controlled strength. She begged, offering anything, everything, if he'd just dropped the charges. She confessed to the affair, to the planning, to her complete misjudgment of who he was. She sobbed that she was sorry, that she'd been stupid, that she'd give back every penny if he'd show mercy. Tyler listened without interrupting. When she finally ran out of words, he spoke with the measured precision of a man who'd already made his decision. "Victoria, I knew about Blake 14 months ago. I knew about the money transfers the moment you started them. I built Sterling Crown specifically to see everything, to control everything, to ensure I'd never be blindsided again after watching my father lose everything to a partner's betrayal. I gave you every chance to stop, to talk to me, to choose differently. You chose this path step by step. Now you'll walk it to the end." She tried again, desperate now, asking what she could possibly do to fix this. His answer was simple. "Nothing. There's nothing you can do. You wanted your freedom and Blake's life. Now you have both, just not the version you imagined." Federal agents arrested Victoria and Blake at their Maldives villa 3 days later. The Maldivian government, which had extensive banking relationships with Sterling Crown, cooperated fully with the extradition request. Victoria wore the same silk dress she'd worn to dinner the night she'd toasted her new life. now wrinkled and stained with tears. The trial was mercifully quick. Victoria's attorneys negotiated a plea deal. 15 years in federal prison in exchange for her cooperation in untangling Blake's investment fraud. Blake, facing evidence from dozens of defrauded investors whose lives he destroyed, received 23 years. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, called their crimes a masterclass in narcissistic entitlement and noted that Victoria's betrayal of her husband had been compounded by her use of his own institution against him. What Victoria did in her desperation, after the arrest but before sentencing, was write a letter. Not to Tyler, he'd made clear he wanted no contact, but to Bloomberg News, the Wall Street Journal, and Financial Times. In the letter, she detailed everything: the affair, the theft, Tyler's secret ownership of Sterling Crown, her complete failure to see the man she'd married. She framed it as a cautionary tale about greed and blindness, but the media saw a better story. Wife steals $100 million using husband's own bank. He was watching the entire time. The story went viral. Tyler, who'd spent years building his bank's reputation on discretion and privacy, suddenly found that privacy shredded by his ex-wife's public confession. Sterling Crown's clients, many of whom valued anonymity above all else, began withdrawing their accounts. Competitors whispered that if Tyler couldn't protect his own marriage secrets, how could he protect theirs? Within 6 months, Sterling Crown lost 32% of its deposits. But the damage to Victoria and Blake was far worse. Victoria's letter, meant perhaps to salvage some dignity or elicit public sympathy, instead became an internet phenomenon mocked by millions. Memes proliferated: when you rob a bank but forget to check who owns it. Late-night comedians crafted entire segments around her spectacular failure. Blake's victims, who'd lost their retirement savings to his schemes, created social media accounts tracking every miserable detail of the couple's incarceration. In prison, Victoria learned that notoriety was its own punishment. Other inmates recognized her from the news, and the jealousy she'd once inspired in her privileged life transformed into hostility in her cell block. She was the rich woman who'd thrown away everything, who'd betrayed a good man for a con artist, who'd been too stupid to realize she was stealing from her own husband's bank. Guards looked at her with contempt. Her fellow inmates alternated between mockery and violence. Blake fared worse. His charm meant nothing in federal prison, where investment fraud marked him as prey. The other inmates, many incarcerated for far pettier crimes, saw him as the epitome of everything wrong with wealthy criminals who destroyed working-class families. He spent most of his sentence in protective custody, isolated and afraid, the confident entrepreneur reduced to a frightened man counting down 23 years. Tyler never spoke publicly about Victoria or the trial. He rebuilt Sterling Crown methodically, implementing new security measures and refocusing on institutional rather than individual clients. He never remarried, though he dated occasionally. Friends who knew him well said he'd changed, not bitter, but sadder, as if some essential trust in human nature had been permanently damaged. 15 years later, Victoria was released from prison at age 52. Blake still had 8 years remaining on his sentence, and she never contacted him after her release. Whatever love or passion had existed between them had been crushed under the weight of consequence and mutual blame. She'd spent a decade and a half thinking about the moment she'd confirmed that final transfer, the triumph she'd felt, the complete blindness to what Tyler had actually built, while she'd been too self-absorbed to notice. She found a small apartment in a city where nobody recognized her, worked as a paralegal under her maiden name, and lived quietly. The fortune she'd tried to steal was long gone, returned to Tyler and used to partially compensate Blake's defrauded investors. The life of luxury she'd imagined had been replaced by efficiency apartments and bus passes. She was free, technically, but crushed in every way that mattered. Tyler, now 55 and one of the banking world's most respected figures, learned of Victoria's release through the automatic notification system. He felt nothing, not satisfaction, not anger, just a distant sadness for the waste of it all. Sterling Crown had survived and eventually thrived, but something in him had hardened. He'd built an empire to protect himself from betrayal, and when betrayal came anyway, he'd watched it unfold with the cold precision of a man who trusted data more than people. What Victoria did, the letter, the public confession, the spectacular implosion she'd made unavoidable, had crushed them all in different ways. She'd crushed herself by transforming private failure into public humiliation. She'd crushed Blake by dragging him into a spotlight that revealed every layer of his fraudulent life. And she'd crushed Tyler, not through the theft he'd anticipated and controlled, but through the public spectacle that had damaged something he'd spent years building. The bank she'd used to hide the money had been his all along, a detail so obvious in retrospect that it became the defining symbol of her blindness. The $100 million she'd emptied had never really left his control. The divorce she'd filed had freed him from a marriage that was already dead. The lover she'd chosen had been a con artist whose schemes were always destined to collapse. In the end, Victoria's calculated betrayal had revealed a simple truth. The husband she'd dismissed as forgettable had seen everything, controlled everything, and ultimately let her destroy herself with the rope she'd woven from her own greed. The wife who'd prided herself on being 10 steps ahead had never realized she was playing a game where the banker husband owned the entire board. What she did crushed them forever, but Tyler Brennan remained standing, alone in the empire he'd built. Wealthy beyond measure and utterly unchanged by the $100 million that had briefly disappeared from his account before returning home. He'd always known it would come back. Banks, after all, were his specialty, and he'd built his to be unbreakable, even when the threat came from inside his own home. 23 years after Victoria had smiled at her phone screen and confirmed that final transfer, she sat in a coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, watching rain streak down the window. At age 60, her beauty had faded into something ordinary. Gray hair she no longer colored, lines etched deep around her eyes, hands that trembled slightly from years of prison stress. She worked as a legal assistant at a small firm that handled workers' compensation cases, lived in a studio apartment above a laundromat, and had exactly $3,000 in her savings account. The young paralegal across from her, an eager 25-year-old named Jennifer, was crying softly into her latte. "He makes me feel invisible," Jennifer said, talking about her husband of 3 years. "He works all the time, never asks about my day, doesn't even notice when I get my hair done. There's this other guy at my gym who actually sees me, who makes me feel alive again." Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest. She saw herself in this girl's face, the same justifications, the same hunger for attention, the same dangerous certainty that she deserved more. For 8 years since her release, Victoria had kept her past secret, using her maiden name and never speaking about the 15 years she'd spent in federal prison or the catastrophic choices that had put her there. But watching Jennifer's tears, seeing the familiar script beginning to play out in another woman's life, Victoria made a different choice. "I need to tell you something," Victoria said quietly. "My real name isn't Sarah Mitchell. It's Victoria Brennan, and 23 years ago, I did exactly what you're thinking about doing." She told Jennifer everything: the affair, the theft, the Maldives villa where her world had collapsed, the moment she learned Tyler owned Sterling Crown Bank. She described the trial, the mockery, the 15 years of prison where every day was punishment for a few months of selfish decisions. She explained how Blake had been released 2 years ago and had died 6 months later from a heart attack in a halfway house, alone and broke and forgotten by everyone except the investors whose lives he destroyed. Jennifer's tears had stopped. Her face had gone pale. "The man who makes you feel alive?" Victoria continued, her voice steady despite the shame that still burned after all these years. "He's making you feel that way because he wants something from you. Maybe not money, maybe just validation or excitement or an escape from his own problems. But I promise you, he doesn't see the real you any more than your husband does. He sees what he wants to see. But my husband is probably exhausted and overwhelmed and taking you for granted," Victoria interrupted, "which is real and valid and worth addressing. But there's a difference between fixing a broken marriage and burning it down because someone new makes you feel special for 15 minutes. Jennifer stared at her. "What happened to your husband, Tyler?" Victoria had followed Tyler's life from a distance, the way you might track a storm system you'd once been caught inside. Sterling Crown Bank had recovered and expanded, now operating in 17 countries. Tyler had never remarried, though there had been a long relationship with a museum curator that ended amicably after 5 years. At 63, he'd begun transitioning leadership of the bank to a carefully selected team while he focused on philanthropic work, funding financial literacy programs for underserved communities and scholarship programs for banking students. She'd seen him once, 2 years after her release, purely by accident at a restaurant in San Francisco. He'd been with business associates, laughing at something someone said, looking relaxed in a way she'd never seen during their marriage. She'd left before he noticed her, understanding that some distances were permanent and necessary. He survived, Victoria said simply. He built something bigger than what I tried to destroy, and he moved on, which is more than I managed to do. That was the truth she'd learned in 8 years of freedom. Tyler had been crushed by her betrayal but not broken, wounded but not destroyed. His empire had survived because he'd built it on something more substantial than ego or greed, on genuine expertise in careful planning and the kind of discipline she'd never possessed. She, on the other hand, had been crushed completely. The woman who'd once spent $5,000 on a handbag now shopped at thrift stores. The wife who'd been invited to exclusive galas now ate dinner alone most nights. The beautiful socialite who'd turned heads at charity events was now invisible in exactly the way she'd once accused Tyler of making her feel. But there was a strange peace in that invisibility, a freedom she'd never known in her old life. No more performance, no more pretending, no more desperate need to be seen and validated and admired. Just existence, simple and small and sufficient. "What should I do?" Jennifer asked, her voice small. Victoria thought about all the advice she might give, all the wisdom purchased through catastrophic failure. But in the end, there was only one thing worth saying. "Go home," Victoria said. "Talk to your husband. Tell him you feel invisible. Go to counseling. Fight for your marriage before you blow it up. Because I promise you, the explosion will destroy so much more than you can possibly imagine right now. And when the smoke clears, you'll be standing in the wreckage wondering how you convinced yourself it was worth it." Jennifer left the coffee shop 20 minutes later, her face thoughtful and troubled. Victoria didn't know if the girl would listen. Probably not. Victoria wouldn't have listened either at that age, too convinced of her own special circumstances and unique justifications. But she'd said it anyway, offered the warning that no one had given her. Victoria finished her coffee and walked home through the rain, her secondhand coat soaking through at the shoulders. Her studio apartment was small and shabby, but it was hers, earned through honest work and careful budgeting. She had no partner, no children, no family who still spoke to her. Just a quiet life built from the rubble of the spectacular one she'd destroyed. That night, as she did sometimes when insomnia struck, Victoria pulled out the box she kept in her closet. Inside was a single photograph from her wedding day, her and Tyler, both impossibly young, smiling at the camera with the careless joy of people who believed love was enough. Tyler's eyes in that photo held something she'd never noticed while living it. Not just love, but trust. Complete, vulnerable trust that she would be his partner in building whatever life came next. She'd broken that trust so thoroughly that even now, decades later, the weight of it could steal her breath. Victoria put the photo away and turned off the light. Tomorrow she'd go to work, file her documents, eat her modest lunch, and ride the bus home. It wasn't the life she'd imagined at 37, standing in that Maldives villa believing she'd won. It was smaller, quieter, infinitely less glamorous. But it was real, and reality, she'd learned too late, was the only thing that lasted. Somewhere across the country, Tyler Brennan was probably reviewing reports or attending a board meeting or having dinner with people who respected him. He'd survived her betrayal and built something that endured. He'd been the banker husband she'd dismissed as forgettable, and he'd turned out to be unforgettable in ways that still made her chest ache with regret. What she'd done had crushed them all, yes, but only she and Blake had stayed crushed. Tyler had risen from the rubble and kept building, kept moving forward, kept living. That was the final lesson Victoria had learned. Some people were builders and some were destroyers. She'd spent 12 years married to a builder without recognizing it. then destroyed everything they had for a man who'd never built anything real in his life. The $100 million had never really been hers. The bank had always been his, and the life she'd thrown away had been the only real thing she'd ever possessed. 23 years later, Victoria Brennan finally understood what she'd lost. It was 23 years too late, but understanding had come anyway, patient and inevitable as rain.